Good evening, everybody. Thank you again. It's nice to be with everybody. I put myself in a bit of a pickle this past Sunday because my plan was to finish up the story of the healing of the impotent man, and then tonight to just pick up from there on what Jesus says in his public discourse because of it. Unfortunately, I didn't finish the healing of the impotent man on Sunday. I would have finished. It was Butchie actually that told me I had to stop. Otherwise, I would have finished. Um, what what basically is going on, or I've been working on. I started actually a couple weeks before, and I recognize that some people aren't with us on Sunday that are with us on Wednesdays, and there's some people who are with us on Sundays that aren't with us on Wednesdays. Did I say that backwards? Some people are with us on Wednesday, but not on Sunday, and some people are with us on Sunday and not on Wednesday. Yes, that's right. If I'm going to talk on the same subjects, they sort of need to stand on their own. By not finishing the story of the impotent man or the healing of the impotent man, I'm going to have to finish that on Sunday. I'm just going to move right on to what Jesus says in his public discourses and try to do as little backstory as possible, or recaps, as we like to call it in Stoughton. But to give you a brief recap, basically 2 Sundays ago for an exhortation, I talked about the healing of the nobleman's son. And the reason why that was important to the series that we're talking about in the Sunday school is because in the Sunday school, we're talking about the public discourses of Jesus in the Gospel of John. And they start in John chapter 5. Prior to John chapter 5, all the things that Jesus did is private. You know, the wedding at Cana and the meeting with the Samaritans and his conversation with Nicodemus and all of that. It's all private except for one brief moment in John chapter 2 where Jesus goes to the temple during Passover. And they ask him why he does the things that he does, and or he has one statement where he says, "Tear down this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days." As we pointed out on Sunday, that's the one thing the Jews remember of all the things that Jesus says in all of his discourses. That's the one thing they can bring back at his trial, because everything else that he says, and he has a lot of public discourses in the Gospel of John to the Jews, to those doubters. That's the only thing that they can remember. So the question that we asked was, well, then who is he speaking to? Even though he's talking to the Jews, who's he really speaking to in these multiple discourses? There's one in chapter 5, there's one in chapter 6. There's one in chapter 7, there's one in chapter 8, there's one in chapter 10, there's one in chapter 11 or 12. Actually, I think it's chapter 12. Well, he's talking to the remnant. He's talking to the believers, and he's trying to get them to understand how to worship the Father in spirit and in truth. That's what we pointed out on Sunday about what he says to the Samaritan woman. That you must worship in spirit and truth, and that the Father is seeking those that do that. And so Jesus is teaching his disciples and his believers, such as ourselves, the true representation of his relationship, specifically with his Father, in a lot of these discourses. Certainly in the first big one, the one that he has in John chapter 5 after the healing of the impotent man. The nobleman story is interesting because at the end of John 4, because Jesus says to the nobleman, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And of course, then he sees the signs and wonders and he does believe. And what happens starting in John 5 is Jesus starts meeting with the public, and he starts doing these same signs and wonders, like the healing of the impotent man, and they see the signs and wonders, and yet they don't believe. They continue to not believe. And part of the reason they don't believe is because of the way that he speaks, because he's revealing to them that their perspective towards his Father is incorrect. And so that's what we're going to talk about this evening. One of the things that we pointed out on Sunday that those of you that were with us will remember, but those of you who aren't, it's just a little recap, is the fact that there's a feast mentioned at the beginning of John chapter 5. It's called the Feast of the Jews, but it's one of the three main feasts. And the question is, which one of the feasts was it? And what we tried to show, and hopefully we showed successfully, is the feast that takes place in John chapter 5 is the Feast of Pentecost. Now, it has to be one of the main feasts because it says that Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So Jesus went to the feast, even though it was a feast of the Jews, meaning that they weren't worshiping God properly in the feast. Jesus was going to worship properly in that feast. And so when you look at the story of the impotent man and what Jesus does, it should fit one of the feasts. And so we looked at the three main feasts. And when we looked at it, it was easy to tell that the one feast that it mirrors is the Feast of Tabernacles. That's where this Deuteronomy 16:9 and 10 comes from. 7 weeks shalt thou number unto thee, begin to number the 7 weeks from such time as thou beginnest to put the sickle to the corn. Well, that's exactly what Jesus is doing in John chapter 5. Like I say, this is his first public event in the Gospel of John. So he's just putting the sickle to the corn. He's just starting his process of harvesting, which is, of course, what Pentecost or the Feast of Weeks represents. Thou shalt keep the Feast of Weeks unto the Lord thy God with a tribute of a free will offering of thy hand. Again, that's exactly what Jesus does to the impotent man. He doesn't go to the impotent man because the impotent man is asking to be healed. He just goes to him. It's a free will offering. In fact, he asks the man if he wants to be healed, and the man doesn't even answer the question, and Jesus still heals him anyway. So it's a free will offering from the Lord at the Feast of Tabernacles, which thou shalt give unto the Lord thy God. And we're going to talk a bit this evening about how he gives it unto the Lord thy God. In other words, he does what he sees his Father doing. And what he sees his Father doing is these free will offerings of his love and kindness, of his grace, if you will. The example that we used on Sunday was the parting of the Red Sea. At the parting of the Red Sea, which mirrors the pool of Bethesda, where the impotent man's healing takes place, at the parting of the Red Sea, Moses says for the words of the Lord, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. In other words, it's not about something you can do. You stand still and I'm going to do this for you. And that's exactly what he does. He parts the Red Sea and they walk across on dry land, not because of anything that they had done. They even say that he takes them out of Egypt in the night. In other words, they were still in darkness. So that's what Jesus sees the Father doing, and so that's what he does. That's the whole purpose of the healing of this impotent man, is to reflect the Father. As it says, according as the Lord thy God hath blessed thee. And Jesus, of course, was given the power to heal. And as we consider his discourse, we'll see that he's given so much more than just the power to heal, because the Father loves the Son. So that's what we talked about on Sunday for those of you that weren't with us. And we got to the point where we were going to talk about the troubling of the waters. We'll cover that on Sunday if you want to join us then. And we didn't actually talk about the healing itself that takes place. We'll also cover that on Sunday. I want to pick up this evening right at the end of the healing when Jesus says this. When Jesus says, take up thy bed and walk. And of course, that's the instruction that he gives to the impotent man that gets the impotent man in trouble, or gets Jesus in trouble with the Jews, because it happened on the Sabbath day. And so in verse 16, it says, therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. So why were the Jews so obsessed with keeping the Sabbath day? Keeping the Sabbath was the big act of righteousness that the community could do, they believed, to bring about redemption, basically to get into God's good graces. The one thing they could do is they could keep the Sabbath day. In other words, you could do nothing on the Sabbath day. In fact, it kind of made me think of Nazi Germany when people were just watching their neighbors to try to catch them, maybe hiding the Jews or something like that. In Jerusalem, there were these people going around, specifically the Pharisees and others, excuse me, who were just watching to see if anybody does anything they're not supposed to do on the Sabbath day, because if you do it on the Sabbath day, then God's not going to be happy with us. And then his salvation is not going to come. His redemption is not going to come. And so they were vigilant about keeping the Sabbath day. And they were dedicated it as a community because the community had to keep the Sabbath day in order for God's mercy and God's redemption and God's love and God's grace and God's approval would come. And of course, there's an obvious counter argument to that idea of, well, you can't do healing on the Sabbath day, and that is the fact that obviously, because of the fact that the healing took place, God was happy with the healing. Otherwise, he would not have allowed the healing to happen. So you have this sort of catch-22, right? Where, excuse me, where you're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath according to the Jews, and yet Jesus is performing a miracle on the Sabbath. Now think about that on the way the Jews would look at it. All of a sudden, along comes this guy, he's doing something like this on the Sabbath day. For generation after generation, we've been striving as a community to perfect the Sabbath by not doing these things on the Sabbath day. And then what? All of a sudden, when one guy comes along and does what they call these things in John chapter 5, verse 16, now we're supposed to throw out the law of the Sabbath? And the answer, of course, is yes, that's exactly correct. But they're not ready to do that. And we'll talk in a minute why they weren't ready to accept this miracle on the Sabbath day. But notice what they do instead of calling it a miracle or calling it a sign. Excuse me, I'm sorry. They say because he had done these things on the Sabbath day, right? They kind of lower it down to just some sort of something that took place. I mean, he gave strength. He healed a man who had been impotent for 38 years. For 38 years, the man had been lying by that pool, impotent. And Jesus comes along and heals him in a moment in time. And their reference to it is that he had done these things on the Sabbath day. But notice it talks about how they persecuted Jesus because of it. And they sought to slay him or to kill him because of it. And that seems to me to be a really strong reaction to what Jesus was doing, almost like an over-the-top kind of reaction that he performs a miracle, these things, on the Sabbath day. And yet, is it because they're so dedicated to the Sabbath day that they'd rather kill somebody than let something like this happen? I think there's more to it than that. In fact, I know there's more to it than that. Yes, they were angry because he was breaking the Sabbath, and they're trying desperately to keep the Sabbath. But this goes back to the very nature of where they're coming from. And the very nature of it is this. Jesus speaking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3. This is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. And you might ask, what's the relationship between this issue of keeping the Sabbath and John chapter 3, verse 19, and the reality about human nature and the reality about those that turn down the light? And the connection is this. If they had just been angry, if they'd just been upset, if they just said, you can't do that, then it would be fine. But when you want to kill somebody for it, that gets into a very, very much deeper reality about what you're doing and what your motivation really is. And remember, God looks at the intent of the heart, right? And what the universal commitment to keeping the law, what it does is it really covers up the true intent of the heart. We don't have to face the light if we can all agree that the light is darkness and the darkness is light. Remember what Brother John Perks talked about a couple of weeks ago when he pointed out that politician that was talking about Christian strength and presenting the light as darkness when we know it's darkness, and we know the light, as John was pointing out, is in weakness. The light is putting your trust in your Father instead of your own strength. That's what this commitment to law really does. And you can see it by their reaction, because their reaction is so far over the top, because the last thing they want to do is be exposed to the light. Now, they might not know that on a conscious level, but there are certain things that they do know on a conscious level that they know they don't want to have to face. Because that's what Jesus does when Jesus responds to them. Jesus responds to them, and his response is going to force them to face their own reality, or to try to kill them in order to not to. And Jesus' response, first and foremost, is this. He says, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work." So Jesus says, the whole law of the Sabbath was that you do no work on the Sabbath day. That's the way they saw the Sabbath. You don't do any work on the Sabbath day. That's what we were commanded to do. So you do nothing, basically. And there are people watching to make sure that everybody's doing nothing on the Sabbath day. And the reason for that is because God rested on the Sabbath, on the seventh day, right? That's the supposed reason. But what Jesus says is, I've been watching my Father now for 33 years. He doesn't rest. He never takes a day off. And if he never takes a day off, how can I take a day off? Because I'm always about my Father's business. So he says, my Father works hitherto. He doesn't stop. He's not, God is not around on the Sabbath day. His work is not being not done on the Sabbath day. And so Jesus says, if he's working, I'm working, right? And of course, they taught that, keeping the Sabbath is what honors God. To do nothing on the Sabbath day is what honors God, because they want to honor God so that God will accept who they are. And Jesus says that's ridiculous. My Father never stops working, so I don't stop working. And the Jews' response, right, was this. Therefore, the Jews sought more to kill him, because not only had he broken the Sabbath, but he said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So let me tell you, the whole reason I started to look at this series was this verse, because I couldn't understand this verse. And that's an interesting fact, that I couldn't understand this verse. How was saying that God was his Father making himself equal with God? I thought about it, and I thought it took me a long time. And the reason it took me a long time is because I was having a hard time seeing it from the Jews' perspective. And the reason I was having a hard time seeing it from the Jews' perspective is because I don't have that perspective anymore. And you don't have that perspective anymore. And so you have to actually stop and really think about it to remind yourself of what that perspective is. And so what is that perspective? Put yourself in their hands, in their perspective, in their thinking. What they're doing in keeping in the law, it's not about God. The God that they see is the God that's expressed in the parable of the talents. The God that they see is that austere man who reaps where he does not sow. That's the God that they recognized. That's the God that they saw. And so it wasn't about God. What it was about was how they were going to be perceived by God. That's what their perspective was. How is what I'm doing or not doing going to be perceived by God? It was all about them. And any law-abiding Jew, or any self-law obsessed Christian, Christadelphian, whatever. This is something that they all know, and we know. It's absolutely true that God can see your heart. He knows who you really are. But that's why you hide in the darkness. That's why you can't stand the light. Because stop doing that. Because you know, they know. Sorry. Because God knows who you are. So you don't want to go into the light because you don't want to be exposed. And so what you do is you keep law. And if you keep law, then you say, as long as God sees me keeping law, then maybe I will be acceptable to God. And I'll never have to be exposed to the light. That's what keeping law is all about. It's a perspective of how God is going to see you. They were law-abiding Jews. They understood their own personal nature, but they never want to show that nature. And so you hide it by the works. And you say, if I keep the Sabbath, and if we keep the Sabbath, then maybe we can be acceptable to God, and we'll never have to change, and we'll never have to face the light. We'll never have to come out of the darkness, because I'm going to call the darkness light, and I'm going to show God my dedication by keeping the Sabbath, and that's what he will accept. There's two problems with that. The first is that God looks at the intents of the heart. He doesn't look at what we do. The second problem is this: why do you want to stay in the darkness? And the reason you want to stay in the darkness is because you like the darkness. That guy that you created through sin, you like that guy. I like that guy. For this guy, for me, that guy is that wise, smart aleck, always has something sharp to say. That guy, I I know he's wicked. I know every intent of his heart is evil, but I know him. I trust him. I like that guy. That's why I never really want to give that guy away. Because I can trust him. He's got me on his side. That's not what Jesus does. But when Jesus says, God is my Father, this is the way they would see it. They would say, you are, by saying God is your Father, making yourself as if you have the righteousness of God. You are making yourself equal with God. That's just what they said. You're making yourself equal with God. And every law-abiding Jew knows that every person is an evil, terrible sinner. So you have no right to make yourself equal with God by calling God your Father. And Jesus' response is, you don't know God. You have no idea who God is because you never see that God. The God you see is the master, just like in the story of the talents. It's a relationship of a master and his servant. It's not a relationship of the Father with the Son, or just the relationship of a father. And so Jesus is going to emphasize again and again and again that God is a father. He comes right back in the very next verse and he says this. He says, verily, verily. In other words, this is absolutely true. I say unto you, the Son can do nothing of himself. You think I'm making myself equal with God? I can't do anything. But this is what I do. What I see the Father do, for whatsoever he doeth, those things the Son likewise does. In other words, I watch the Father and I see what he does. I don't get obsessed with my relationship to the Father. My relationship to the Father is based upon him, not upon me. Of course, he wasn't a wicked sinner, but they didn't know that. But that's not his response, because he says, I can do nothing. He's another human like everybody else. But what I see my Father doing, that's what I do. And that's what any loyal son does. is he sees what his Father does and he copies it. And that's just what Jesus did. That's the whole story of the impotent man, is he sees what the Father's doing, and that's what he does. In fact, that's part of the story of the nobleman, right? When we talked about the nobleman, and we said the nobleman was a politician. He was a quid pro quo kind of guy. But he had one thing that wasn't quid pro quo, and that was his love for his son. And so that's what Jesus is talking about. All I really do is I watch the Father. And what I see him doing, that's what I do. So, consider the Exodus. We talked about it. He sees the Father part the Red Sea, even though they were still sinners, even though they were still disobedient, he still did. And again and again and again, the grace of God is seen again and again and again without any sort of like quid pro quo, no payback. There is no payback. So that's exactly what he does with the impotent man. And by the way, that's why we're never told whether the impotent man changes, because the whole point of the healing of the impotent man is there is no payback. That was the same point as the healing of the nobleman. There's no payback to the nobleman. Jesus gets nothing out of it. That's what Jesus sees the Father doing. A true relationship with God is based upon who God is, not based upon who we are in relation to him. That's what they didn't understand. It's a father and son relationship and not a master-servant relationship. And so what Jesus does is he goes on and he says this: For the Father loveth the Son, and showeth him all things that he himself doeth, and he will show him greater works than these, that ye may marvel. I want to consider just for a few minutes this incredible statement where Jesus says, the Father loves the Son. Remember again the nobleman, the politician, the man whose entire setup was, you take care of me and I take care of you. And yet his relationship with his son was not like that. He went from Capernaum to Cana because of his love for his son. He lowered himself before some itinerant preacher because of his love for his son. His love for his son was everything. Now consider the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ. He is the Almighty. He is the perfect God. He, all things are before him. All things are possible with him. And everything is founded in Scripture on the Father's love for the Son. It's everything in Scripture. Look what he says. Look what Jesus says in John chapter 17. He says, of course, he's in the midst of his prayer with his disciples. And he says, Father, I will that they also, whom thou hast given me, be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory which thou hast given me. For thou loved me before the foundation of the world. Before anything was created, the Father loved the Son. Everything is founded upon the Father's love for the Son. And everything is possible because of the Father's love for the Son. Let's consider some of the things in that relationship. Consider what happens at the birth, before the birth, even before the conception. The angel comes to Mary and he says, he shall be great, talking about the child that she will bear. And he shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord shall give unto him the throne of his father David. Now consider what he's saying there. It's amazing. He said he's going to give the throne of his father David, but he will be called the Son of the Highest. In other words, people will know that he's the son of David, that he's a descendant of David. They'll know that. He's going to be given that throne. but they will come to know that he's much, much more than that, that he's the Son of the highest, that he is the literal Son of God. And I want to consider a place where that comes out in the most remarkable spot you could possibly think of, and that's at the cross. At the cross, you had this man, this centurion, and the others that were with him, who were just observers. That's it, they had a job to do, but they're not even involved in the situation beyond doing their job. And notice what it says. Now, when the centurion, and they were with him watching Jesus. This is the moment of crucifixion. This is the moment of his death. This is what from a worldly perspective is the lowest moment anyone has ever had to endure. This sinless man dying on the cross. We can feel the pain. And yet the centurion sees it and sees everything that goes on, the darkness, the earthquake, everything, the response of everyone that watches. And it says, uh, and Jesus saw I'm sorry. Now, when the centurion and they that with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this is the Son of God. What an incredible reaction to what they were saying. They said, this is the Son of God. And the angel told Mary, that is exactly what they're going to call him, the Son of the Highest. They could see the Almighty. They could see the earthquake. It's mentioned. And they said, this is the Son of God. And that's just what Jesus is. He's the Son of God. Notice what it said in that verse we just considered a minute ago. When we said, and the Father loveth the Son and show him all things unto himself, and he will show him greater works than these, that ye may marvel. And Jesus goes on in this chapter to say, you're going to see even greater things than the healing of the impotent man. Look what he says in the next few verses. In verse 21, now again, he's talking to the Jews, but the people that are supposed to hear it is you and I. We're the ones that are supposed to understand what he's saying, because they certainly didn't. They didn't even remember it when they were asked. In verse 21, he says, this is right after he says, the Father loveth the Son, therefore, for as the Father raiseth up the dead and quickeneth them, even so the Son quickeneth whom he will. So the Father loves the Son before the foundation of the world. And the Father gives him the power to raise the dead. Now, yes, there were other people that had that power, but he gives him the power to do it. And he has more than that. In verse 22, it says, for the Father judgeth no man, but hath committed all judgment unto the Son. God, the Father does that with no one else. No one else is given all judgment unto the Son. Jesus is going to judge everything. And the Father's not going to sit there and dissect it and say, well, you did this good, you didn't do that right. No. He gives it all to him. That's how much he loves his Son, how much he trusts his Son. In verse 23, he says that all men should honor the Son even as they honor the Father. There's no separation, even though he can say, of myself I can do nothing. There's no separation between the honor of the Father and the Son because of the love of the Father for the Son. In verse 24, he says, verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my words and believe on him that sent me hath everlasting life, and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from death unto life. He gives him the power of life itself, the power of eternal life. You make the decisions. Who receives eternal life? The Father gives that to the Son. I mean, this is quite a business Jesus has taken on, and taking on his Father's business. And yet it is the love of the Father for the Son that drove everything that he did, that drove him to the sinless life that he lived, that leads him even to this day in his Father's heaven, guiding, even when he comes back. All things are his, because from the very foundation of the world, the Father loved the Son and gave all things unto him. Notice what it says later on in the chapter. He says, I am come in my Father's name. If you receive me not, if another shall come on in his own name, him you will receive. But how can ye believe, which receive honor one of another, and seek not honor that cometh from God alone? Notice where it's coming from. It's coming from God. That was everything Jesus was telling them. I watch the Father, and I do what the Father does. And he has given me all things, and I do exactly what he wants done because of who the Father is. That's why I do it. And my motivation, my Father's love. It was there from the very foundation before the world began, and it drove everything. And he took it all in and was a perfect obedience of the Father. And so, where does that put us, brothers and sisters, as servants of the Son? It puts us in a situation in which it is all about the relationship between the Father and the Son. It's not about our sinfulness. Yes, we're sinners. Yes, we have to face, just like Paul did, "O wretched man that I am. Who can save me?" We have to go into the light. We have to face the light. And we have faced the light. And we continue to face the light each time we fall short. But each time we fall short, and each time we get down upon ourselves for what we did, and we want to turn back into the darkness because it's right there calling to us. It's right there. It's good over here. You don't have to stand in the light. Each time we do that, we have to turn back to the relationship between the Father and the Son. That's what you and I are called to. We're not called to all the things that the world is called to. We're called to be witnesses and, as best as we can, reflections of the relationship between the Father and the Son. And its whole foundation lies in the love of the Father for the Son. All things can be done because of the love of the Father for the Son. And our faith and our lives are founded upon the love of the Father for the Son. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.